Hi everyone, I'm John Rennie and welcome to the Boneyard. Filmmaker Bob Clark has always been someone I've greatly respected. Clark's very personal movie, A Christmas Story, is one of the most successful festive movies of all time and plays in constant rotation every Christmas on TV and streaming services. His teen movie, Porky, is still considered one of the forerunners of the teen sex comedy and has influenced countless imitations, most famously the American Pie series. But like many other filmmakers who would make their names in movies in the 1980s, Clark began his feature film career in horror movies. His first feature was the very dark comedy Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, which towards its ending takes a sudden turn into pure nightmare fuel when a horde of flesh-eating zombies begin tearing our hippie protagonists apart and then head off into the night to tear society apart. Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things is a movie that stayed with me long after my first viewing. That ending was pretty damn scary to a young kid seeing it on grainy VHS tape late at night. A few years later, Clark would direct the hugely influential Black Christmas, which is considered by many as one of the quintessential horrors that inspired the slasher genre, preceding John Carpenter's Halloween by 4 years. And in between these two movies, Clark directed Alan Ormsby's script of The Veteran, which later was retitled The Night Walker and then finally Dead of Night. It was years later that I would see the film on a second or third generation degraded VHS cassette when it had been retitled Death Dream, which I believe it had been retitled when it was bought for late night TV syndication in the United States. It was this version that I was immensely pleased to get later on DVD from Blue Underground in around 2004. They really were such a great and pioneering label. Bob Clark had a heck of a career, making great movies in every genre. In his later years, he moved into television movies, made a fun sequel to his family favorite Baby Geniuses, and worked as a director for hire, until his tragic, untimely death in a car crash along with his son in 2007. Clark will be remembered forever for A Christmas Story and Porky, but it is one of his earlier works, the politically charged horror movie, that I want to take a look at this episode. So lock up the family pets as we take a look at society let loose upon itself in Bob Clark's Death Dream.
Hi, Andy. How's everything?
Everything's fine, Bob. Let's go.
Some movies will stay with you forever because they had an effect on you at a young age or were able to be relatable to you just at the right time in your life.
That was a long time ago.
To give you some context of my understanding of this movie, when I first saw Death Dream, I was coming of age, and many school leavers from my group of friends joined the army, and after basic training, they were sent to war. Most of them came back as better people. A friend who was on the wrong side of the track, so to speak, came back, and they'd become one of the most well-mannered people I have ever met, and now they wouldn't dream of stealing anything. I knew a mechanic who came back and started their own business and is now immensely successful. So to say the least, the military works out for many young people. But on the flip side of that, one of the toughest people that I ever met came back from flying planes in the war and had suffered so much emotionally that he could hardly speak to people or even look at friends such as myself in the eyes when we spoke to each other. I am also a filmmaker, and for 2 years I worked on 3 documentary projects as an editor on the subject of PTSD in serving personnel. So I ended up having some experience around the subject of soldiers who return to Civvy Street and need a period of adjustment in their lives to make that change. But please don't get me wrong throughout this review. I don't want to offend anybody with this video, and I understand that there is no way that I could ever claim to know what it is like to serve your country in war. And I have the uttermost respect for anybody who who gives up their own freedom to protect my freedom and the freedom of their countries. There is one story I have from when I was younger that did have a huge impact on me. I did the whole backpacking thing when I was young and carefree, and while I was in Europe I met an American expatriate who briefly mentioned in passing at the bar that he'd been a soldier in the Vietnam War. Being a young and not too experienced kid in the ways of communication and human language, I asked him to tell me about his experiences, not realizing he didn't want to talk about it. And I'll never forget that moment. He turned, looked up from his glass, looked me dead in the eyes and said, "John, there is a reason why I don't live in my own country anymore. I'm a man without a country. Don't you ever ask me about that again, please." He was shaking when he told me this and was not the person that I knew and had become friends with. His eyes, his manner, body language and everything just seemed to change. And that day I learned a huge lesson. War can change everything and everybody. I came so close to joining myself. I was standing next in line at a mobile signing up office/caravan that was stationed in my local grocery store car park, and right at the last minute, I turned away. And instead, I took a job at a local car plant, which was, and I think still is, the biggest employer in my hometown. For years, this choice made me feel like a coward. My generation had fought in a war, and I didn't step up to the plate. I know that's a little bit deep and off topic, but I think it gives my opinion of this movie a lot of context. And that's how I felt as a young person at the time.
We lost a lot of good boys in that war. We kept some we should have lost. What's the matter? Did I say something?
It was around this time that I first saw Death Dream. And as I think everyone will agree who has either seen this movie or read about it, that the script by Alan Ormsby is most certainly from the standpoint of an individual against the way that war divides families and takes the lives of our young people who sign up or who at the time were being drafted to fight in the Vietnam War against their will.
Death Dream was originally called The Veteran, and it was kind of a variation on The Monkey's Paw, but with a with a Vietnam vet coming back from the dead. So it had a sort of political theme, I guess, which was a little unusual, and still is, I think, in those kind of movies. And I remember when we were casting it in New York, there was a play called Sticks and Bones, a play by David Reeve, which was kind of similar. The script actually got some serious attention, but the movie kind of vanished without a trace.
Now there are most certainly other films made around this time that had a hint of this kind of political statement in them, such as Brian De Palma's Hi Mom and Greetings, about a group of young men trying to avoid the draft with funny and also tragic consequences. But in Death Dream, the political statement is the very fabric of the movie itself. And that's what makes it a very interesting film, because it truly has something to say.
Hey Andy, you see a lot of action over there? Kill any guys? Remember me, Andy? Freddie Anderson? I grew 2 inches.
We might not
last
agree
time I
with
saw
it,
you. You know,
but it's what art was made for writers and artists to express one's individual opinion. Apparently, when Bob Clark read Alan Ormsby's first draft of the screenplay, he said it was so perfect that they shouldn't change a thing. And it was the very first draft that they went into production with.
There weren't very many overtly political horror films at the time. No one was making a statement in the genre. And if they were, it was pretty buried in the subtext. But it's right on the surface with Death Dream.
In short, the story of Death Dream is one of a young soldier named Andy who was killed in the war. His family receives his death notice from the military, but they find it impossible to accept his passing. The movie then takes influence from that old classic tale, The Monkey's Paw, and Andy's mother's grief works as a kind of dark blessing.
You're alive.
Then unexpectedly in the middle of the night, Andy returns home. But it soon becomes apparent that he's not the same boy who left his quiet Florida suburb. There is so much going on in this small town horror. Andy begins acting ignorant at first and has no consideration for anyone or anything around him. He then disobeys his parents, and then in an awful scene of horror, he kills the family dog. Piece by piece, Andy begins to literally tear his family, friends, and town apart.
He's crazy. There's something the matter with him.
Take your hands off of me!
There is one line in the movie that sums up the whole message perfectly. When Andy is invited to the family doctor's office for a chat, Andy stalks the doctor, and then in a terrible burst of violence turns on him, gets him up against the wall and utters the words,
I died for you, Doc. Why shouldn't you return the favor?
These words, I think, are spoken in anger from the immense sense of tragedy that Andy feels. The war took his life, and he wants people to understand that this is what actually is going on in war after they turn off the radio and turn off their TV sets.
You owe me something, Doc.
I think actor Richard Backus, who played Andy, says it best when he talks about playing the character.
I really felt the power of the film, and I felt the pathos of the character. And coming back to a small town and finding that people there didn't really understand what had happened or what was happening in Vietnam. So I think that made him kind of bitter and kind of resentful and wanting to show them what it was like to go through that kind of horror.
There is also something else really interesting about this movie, and the way that there are fans who describe it as a zombie movie, which is actually what brought me to the movie in the first place, as when I was younger I was a huge zombie fan at the time. But there are also those who consider it a vampire movie, and in a way, they both make sense. I think Andy is a zombie, in the sense he is dead, soulless, and dead flesh walking around. And we know this as throughout the movie, his body deteriorates. But he injects blood and his body rejuvenates. Well, most of the time, because his eyes keep rotting in his head.
Please come on, we've got to leave right now, Andy, please.
But the vampirism aspect adds another interesting layer of commentary to the movie. The way Andy injects the blood is the same as the many soldiers who returned from war addicted to drugs such as heroin that were readily available in the late 60s and early 70s to soldiers, and many used it as a coping mechanism. And I'm pretty sure Ormsby's script was making this point about returning soldiers and addiction to drugs they used to cope with the violence, terror, and the unfortunate PTSD that war can cause. There is also a fantastic song about this element of war, which paints this same tragic story in music by singer John Prine called Sam Stone, that was released a few years earlier in 1971. For anybody interested, I'll link that song in the description below. The addiction aspect runs even deeper in the narrative, as we see that Death Dream is also a movie about the nuclear family falling apart. Andy's father turns to alcohol to deal with the stress of the situation when Andy kills the family dog. And this is perhaps an echo of Andy's addiction, as we know from history that the drug of choice for soldiers returning from World War II was alcohol.
It's quite a war, that World War II. You remember that war, Mr. B?
Well, it's not hard to remember.
Again, echoed in music of the period with the incredibly powerful song Drunken Ira Hayes by the great Peter Lafarge, about one of the soldiers who died an alcoholic even after returning home as a true hero. Ira Hayes was one of the 5 brave Marines who were immortalized in the photograph and film of the second raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. This image gave us one of the most iconic, heroic, and most reproduced images of the Second World War. Again, for music lovers, I'll link the song in the description below. I mention these songs as I believe that Death Dream is as much a part of the anti-war movement and protests against the war in Vietnam as these iconic songs were that came well before it. And Death Dream was one of the first movies to be forthrightly outspoken against the Vietnam War, which I think makes it a very important movie, one that I think may have deserved a lot more attention at the time of its release.
Andy?
Hello, Joanne.
I recently watched Wes Craven talking about the effect that the war and that the 1960s had on a lot of artists, musicians, and filmmakers in preparation for another video that I'm making, and his words deeply resonated with me in relation to what I mentioned earlier about my respect for our military and my friends and family who have served, but also my feelings of cowardice for not serving my country. Craven said this.
I think the entire nation was just repeatedly traumatized by the events of that time and still is mystified by what the forces were at work during those times also. You know, there's so many mysteries about all of those murders and assassinations and historical events that just left you feeling completely at the mercy of this drunken fate. I feel like I'm a veteran of a war, and I think we all do from that generation, whether you went to the war or not. You know, it was just, it had come home.
And that kind of hit home with me, and is a big learning curve about why creatives do what they do. Sometimes these movies aren't just movies. They are a reflection of society and individuals' views through a lens that can often speak for a generation. It reminds me that it is why physical media and archiving movies is so important, and why we shouldn't just subscribe or conform to a cloud that sells us movies we don't even own, even after we've paid for them. Movie preservation is really important, and I've got to thank Blue Underground in 2004 for preserving what I think is a work of art that has something to say and is important as a historical record of these young, low-budget, 30-something filmmakers' views of their time and their generation.
Won't be late, will you, Andy?
Low-budget cinema, because of its limitations and the need to use real locations, real fashions, and regular folks of the time period, make these movies a record of when they were made, and that is why, as much for entertainment, we need to support, preserve, and give a voice to independent cinema. In the end, as much as I love them as works of cinema, we don't study or talk about Paint Your Wagon, Winning, or Where Eagles Dare from the 1960s half as much as we talk about Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde, Z, or the works of Agnes Varda. We learn more from the independents, and movies like these need to be preserved for our future generations. Needless to say, I think Death Dream is a great horror movie, and here on The Boneyard I most certainly recommend it to fans of low-budget horror. And if you can look past the imperfections, it really is a great horror movie. It even has the privilege of boasting renowned makeup artist Tom Savini's first credited role. Savini is a legend to me, and he assisted writer Alan Ormsby with all the great makeup effects that were created to show Andy's grotesque, decomposing appearance. And he must have learned a lot, because there are makeup effects that are strikingly similar to that in his later works, such as The Great Dawn of the Dead. So to true horror fans, Death Dream is worth a look just to see Tom Savini's earlier works alone, and for a time, it was that reason that kept Death Dream in circulation. At its heart, this movie has an awful lot to say. It's about the true horror of war, addiction, PTSD, family trauma, and about how the sins of the father can be passed on to the son. And it is also a character study of a family dealing with the horror of losing a child. The ending of this movie is so downbeat and tragic that you begin to empathize with Andy, who has been murdering society throughout the movie, and in the final moments, there is a gut-wrenching scene that shows us the immense tragedy of what it really means for a mother to bury her child. Be prepared if you decide to give this movie a chance, because it is not an easy watch by any means, and will stay with you long after the credits roll. At least it definitely did with me. If the dead could stand up and talk, what would they have to say? That is a truly terrifying premise, because if they all feel the same way as Andy, we're all in for a horrific wake-up call from our own Death Dream. Thanks for watching my take on Bob Clark and Alan Ormsby's terrific low-budget shocker Death Dream, a movie that I am very passionate about. If you would like to hear more from me on Bob Clark and other filmmakers, please remember to like, share, and subscribe in order to help me keep digging up classic cinema here in the Boneyard. Please let me know if you're a fan of Death Dream in the comments below, because I'd love to have a chat about it. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.